Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Spencer here, as well as myself, Brad. And today we're talking about an interesting development in the cyber threat landscape. So there's a group known as Midnight Blizzard, or APT 29. I don't know where they get these names, man.
Right?
I really don't.
I blame Microsoft for the Midnight Blizzard thing. They recently changed like their naming convention.
Did they?
And yeah.
Yeah, they always give them like cool or cute names, you know, like Fuzzy Pillow or something.
Well, Midnight Blizzard sounds like something you get at Dairy Queen.
Yeah, it does. Or a video game or something like that, right? But they're actually a sophisticated Russian group. They're a state level group, and they're focusing on governments, diplomats, IT service providers, and really in U.S. and Western Europe. So the tactic is what we're here to talk about today, right? Threat actors are not new, APTs are not new. What we're really here to focus on is this technique, and I'm going to let you kind of dive into that. You know a little bit more about it than I do. But it's an interesting technique, and it's not even really necessarily a new technology that they're attacking. It's just a new spin on things. So
yeah,
take it away.
Yeah, so this is phishing with malicious RDP files. If I can word and
it's still Monday, man.
Malicious RDP files. So this group, Midnight Blizzard, they're using malicious RDP files in their spear phishing campaigns, which is, I guess, a new approach for them. For those kind of in the IT space, you kind of know what RDP is. RDP is used to remotely access other computers, other resources for many organizations, right? If you're in IT, you use RDP all the time. If you're not in IT, if you're listening, just know that RDP is used to remotely access, other computers, other resources. So this group is using these RDP files, but how they're doing it is a little bit interesting, and the techniques that they're using after the fact for various things. So RDP, and I don't want to jump ahead too far, but RDP can be used for a lot of different things. And along with RDP, there are a lot of capabilities like mapping drives. You can access printers. And what I mean by that is like you can have that remote resource be able to access your printer. So like when you print something on the remote resource, it goes to your printer on your, local machine or whatever. So, so this group has been spear phishing with these malicious RDP files. So we're going to talk a little bit about what happened, how does this RDP, thing work, and what does the attack look like? And we're going to talk about what to do about it and kind of some of our advice for mitigating this.
Yep. So before we get too far into that, I want to semi deep dive on what RDP is, how it's constructed, all that good stuff. So it's remote desktop protocol. It is primarily a Microsoft. Like you said, you've already covered a little bit of this, but RDP is actually a collection of different things, right? So one, it is a service. Right. So it runs on a port. It listens for remote connections. It is also a protocol. So it runs over usually port 3389. It has specific mechanics with regards to encryption. But it's also a file. And I think that's where we're going to go with this, right? Is when you have the ability to effectively save an RDP session as a shortcut or as a .rdp file. I think it's .rdp.
Yep.
And basically when you click on the file, you open the file, it instantly creates a connection based on its configuration. And so, by default, it'll pass over 3389 to an IP, connect to it. And then what happens after that is kind of dictated by the file itself, right? So hopefully I'm not jumping too far ahead. But yeah, so you can actually configure them to like auto authenticate, for example. And so if you were to do that, then the connection would be established. And like you said, you can map resources from the local or remote host to each other.
Yep.
And so all of that can really happen very quickly using an RDP file, if you will, to do those things. So did I jump ahead?
No, that's good. That's good. Okay. So, this Midnight Blizzard group, they're using signed RDP configuration files. And like Brad said, these RDP files have configuration settings stored with them. So that's what is being manipulated here, is those settings in that RDP file. But essentially, these RDP files are signed with like a Let's Encrypt certificate. and then they're sent, and like you said, when they're opened, they're automatically a connection is automatically established, right, with
Yep.
the actors, servers. So how does this RDP thing work? So this kind of started. So the Microsoft article this week or last week, whatever it was, prompted this podcast, and that's where they kind of talked about Midnight Blizzard and their campaign since October of this year, kind of using this. This technique, though, goes back a couple of years, I believe. I think it was 2021. I forget what the date was on the original blog post by Mike Felch.
Still relatively recent, though.
Yeah, so I'm looking for a date on the blog. February 28th, 2022. So February 28th, 2022, a researcher by the name of Mike Felch out of BHIS kind of discovered this technique. He coined it or dubbed it Rogue RDP, and essentially uses a malicious RDP server and a weaponized RDP connection file to trick the victim into connecting and giving the attacker access to their computers, kind of like we said. So this technique relies on the fact that RDP files are often allowed by email gateways and clients. They're more or less benign files, right? This isn't a malicious file by any means. Right.
It's literally a text file full of configuration stuff that's interpreted by the client when you run it. So it's just a shortcut with config options is all it is.
Yeah, exactly. So Mike Felch kind of discovered this technique and kind of laid out a blog post of how it works, how to kind of go about attacking this or using this to attack an individual or an organization. And so when the target, when you open the RDP attachment, like we said, that RDP connection gets established, and then there's a connection, like Brad said, in between the two hosts, right? And that connection allows for various things, which we kind of already alluded to. One of which is the files in the directories, right? So when you map or when you connect to that host, you can map local drives, and those local drives are readable and writable, by that target system and by the local system, right? So one thing that the Midnight Blizzard was doing is they were using these malicious RDP files. They were making that connection, and they had access to the target's file system. So they were looking for files. They were crawling through shares after they had mapped the drives. They were doing some discovery and reconnaissance, looking for, sensitive files, credentials, things like that. So that is kind of a big attack surface for me from this is if I can get access to a file system, that's huge. Great. There are unattended files, password files, log files that have interesting information into it. If I can get an attack, if I can send a phishing email, right, get access to their file system, that can be, very impactful.
Yeah, man. And my mind automatically goes to the way that the RDP server works on the remote system, right? So if I'm thinking from an attacker's perspective, there are a ton of things I can do on certain events, such as login events, right? So if that RDP file automatically goes back and it auto-auths, logs into my server, there's a ton of stuff I can do with those resources, by just enumerating those, crawling through those, and we're talking like seconds of time between the successful connection and what I could potentially do from a malicious perspective with regard to access to those resources. So,
yep. Yeah. And then, anything else that you have connected. So smart cards is common in some organizations, right? But other peripherals, printers, those kinds of things can get connected. You can map those. You can connect those on an RDP session. Another one that's interesting is web authentication. So with Windows Hello, passkeys, security keys, that's an interesting attack surface too, is like, if, when, and how that kind of those authentications go across, there's probably potential for abuse there, which is also very interesting, right, from an attacker perspective. If I somehow manage to phish somebody in IT, right, and they have a smart card or something like that, that could be pretty dangerous.
Yeah, for sure, man. I mean, the options are endless, right? Your imagination is the limit when it comes to what you can do with this. So.
Yeah. So, so going back to kind of Midnight Blizzard, they sent these phishing emails. They accessed the victims, their computer, the resources, I mentioned the files, peripheral smart cards. The phishing email, though, I think was kind of interesting too, and worth kind of pointing out the kind of the phishing emails that they were using. They were impersonating Microsoft, and they were referencing these AWS or Zero Trust frameworks. So kind of an interesting lure. I don't know if they shared exactly the details of the phishing email.
Yeah.
But kind of an interesting lure to kind of get to make it believable that you would have to click an RDP file, or you would, because with those RDP files, right, it's not just you click it and then everything's good, right? There's some prompts that happen
It
throughout
pops
that
up a
process.
dialogue. Yeah.
So you have to create a believable, if you're an attacker, you have to create a believable pretext or a believable phish to trick someone into clicking accept or okay, those confirmation prompts to get to that point. So that is the difficult part, right? Is the RDP files will probably get through, probably less so now that everybody is kind of paying attention to this. Everybody is hopefully blocking those in their email security platforms and firewalls and things. But yeah, that phish is kind of a core component to the success of this campaign, which looked to be, fairly successful based on the article.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm surprised that RDP was allowed in all the way up until now. Like just a little bit surprised. Like of all the file extensions that would be part of normal business, the idea of emailing an RDP file is like very far from the normal course of business. And so when I think about like, okay, we're gonna whitelist some extensions, or I guess we're probably blacklisting instead of whitelisting, right? So just so everybody knows, in the security world, we always prefer whitelisting because the list is short and everything else is denied. So it's kind of like an ACL with regards to that. But I think that email kind of works the other way around for the most part, is that we're blocking dangerous extensions and allowing everything else, which creates a lot of opportunities that, where you can get a little creative with a file, like in this case. But yeah, I was just kind of surprised that RDP was still being allowed, and that it wasn't universally blocked everywhere just because of how dangerous it is. And then I was also surprised that we're not egress filtering 3389.
Yeah.
I mean, not that they can't change the port, right? Like you can change that in the config file, but still, I mean, man, in my previous lives, we were only allowing 443 and 80 outbound. Like there was nothing else allowed. And even those were going through content filters and categorization and stuff like that. So I don't know, man. It's wild.
And I think, so Mike Felch in his original blog post, he kind of talks about, changing the port from 3389 to different ports and kind of experimenting with that, depending on what the target has open and available. Another interesting attack with this RDP file thing is the clipboard. So you can monitor the clipboard and you can plant the clipboard contents, apparently.
Oh, that's cool. Okay.
So if anybody remembers, I think there was a name for this type of phish, but it was where you go to a website and it says you need to Control V, or you do Windows key run and then Control V and hit enter, and that executes the payload. I forget, somebody on Twitter shared the name of that type of technique. John Hammond did a video on it, but essentially it's kind of like you could kind of do something like that where you trick the user into connecting the RDP, running a command, opening the run prompt, pasting a command and hitting enter, and like downloading your beacon or something. So there's potential for that, but also monitoring the clipboard too is kind of an interesting attack as well.
Yeah, and just so so folks know, programmatic interaction with the clipboard is so easy. And so I'll kind of reference some work that I did with clipboard. So, I've said many times I worked in the financial world. There was a time when our primary threat was insiders, and our insiders were usually customer service reps. So the people that you talk to on the phone when you call to have something done with your bank account. And so I actually wrote a Python clipboard monitor that we installed as an agent and ran as a service on those machines that would, anytime something landed in the clipboard, it would grab the source application, if possible, and anything else that was running to see if people were copying and pasting out client data and saving it and emailing it to themselves or whatever. And so that was like one of the counter mechanisms that we used. But it's really easy to interact with a clipboard. Microsoft makes it super easy programmatically to do that.
Yeah. So a couple other things I wanted to mention about the RDP attacks that I think are important for people to kind of know or kind of recognize. It's important to know, obviously, what is possible, but also where that attack takes place and kind of specifically where code runs in relation to these attacks. So when you make that connection, right, and you're enumerating the drives and you're like, looking for stuff, a lot of that runs on the attacker's machine. So, it runs on the malicious server, right? So your EDR product is not necessarily going to pick up on that. It's definitely not going to see the code that's running on the attacker server that's getting executed, right? If there's things that you're executing on the victim's machine, obviously that could get detected, or those things could be visible. But a lot of this code runs on the malicious server, on the attacker server, so right. EDR is less effective in these situations, which is also why this is an interesting attack.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it checks all the boxes, man. And really, unless you're looking for persistence, there's not that much I imagine you need to run on their machine. I guess it depends on the goals, right?
Yep.
But you can do almost everything you want to do just through the map resources, I would imagine.
Yep. So, like we talked about, mapping shares and then searching for sensitive files, planting files. So planting like an LNK file that triggers something, triggers a logon script or a logon script, even, planting a logon script, planting binaries in those common auto run locations, DLLs. There are common applications like Teams and other applications that are susceptible to sideloading or DLL proxying attacks, hijacking attacks. So you could plant DLLs, because you have access to the file system. So anything where you can kind of like drop files or read files is an attack vector. There's also potential apparently for code execution.
Yep.
So the researcher Mike Felch mentioned in his article that in some weird kind of strange combinations of Hyper-V plus writable file shares, there's like some magic incantation for code execution.
Right.
Which is interesting, right? To be able to get code execution through an RDP session, like with an RDP file.
Yeah, like a reverse directional code execution. That's pretty wild. Yeah.
It's kind of crazy. There's not much available on the information. He did mention another researcher that kind of had worked on this a little bit and maybe figured some of this out. Sure. But definitely things to be mindful of and wary of.
Yeah, man, that's pretty wild. It really is. And like I said, it's just so obvious, right? Like those of us in the IT world that understand how RDP works, we know how dangerous it is, right? It is. Yep. It is like threat level 10 when it comes to finding these services and so like the fact that we're just casually emailing RDP files back and forth is just bizarre to me, dude.
It's like no IT admin ever would think having RDP open on the internet is a good idea. It's essentially what allowing 3389 outbound is, and allowing RDP files in email.
Just absolutely blows my mind. And then it begs the question, like, what else? Right? What else are we not thinking of?
Yeah.
That's wild, man. That's absolutely wild. So what do we do?
Yeah. Good question. So we had already talked about quite a bit of this, but one is, restricting outbound RDP. Yeah. So outbound RDP connections, you have to do that on your firewalls. So at the bare minimum, restricting 3389.
Yeah.
If you have more advanced firewalls, you might be able to do more, like layer 7 type stuff potentially, for blocking. But at the very least, just having good outbound filtering is going to be a good control here, a good mitigating factor in your firewall. And then the second big one is blocking RDP files, right? In email, but also chat if you can. I don't know, how sophisticated the administrative portion of Slack and Teams and other chat platforms are to be able to restrict file types from being shared and things like that. But if not, that's definitely something to be mindful of, is like, hey, you can still send people a Teams message. You could still get access to Slack and send them a Slack message. There are other vectors to receive these RDP files than just email. So you want to be mindful of that and make sure that those are restricted wherever possible.
Yeah. So look, man, these first two bullet items speak more largely to overall hygiene to me than they do
Hmm.
about specific defense mechanisms, right? So let me explain what I mean by that. So like when we're talking about outbound RDP connections, generally speaking, the only traffic that should be traversing your choke points, and your choke point are basically just an aggregate where all of your data should be entering and or should be leaving your environment. First of all, if you don't have a choke point, you're wrong. Right. If you have multiple egress points and you have no visibility
Hmm.
into those, you're already setting yourself up for failure. Most people, I think, are doing a good job of having singular egress points. And so again, block everything you don't need, man. And
Yep.
and so if and even the stuff that you are allowing should pass through some type of vetting process. And so that can be we don't allow direct connections to IP addresses. Right, that's the number one thing for me. Is if it's not a DNS based request, I'm killing that thing at the firewall, dude.
Hmm.
Absolutely killing it. And we're just creating a little bit of a higher bar for a bad guy to get stuff out of the environment, right?
Yep.
And even if it does have a domain name and you are resolving DNS, you should be filtering that based on its reputation, right? You should be doing reputational assessments of any outbound host-based requests. So if you just do those two things and only allow 443 and 80 out, filter that, you killed this thing. Right,
Yep.
it's already dead in the water. So then move to the next one. Talking about and I've already kind of touched on this a little bit, today, but
Yep.
block everything you don't need, which it should be inverse of that. It should be allow only the things that you do,
Yep.
and then make exceptions where necessary, right? If there's a certain inbox that takes, like I was working with a client on a website pen test recently, and there was some kind of fancy template files that they used, right? Yeah,
Yep.
okay, fine. Make an exception for that. And if you can limit that to a singular inbox, do it. Same thing with
Yep.
outbound traffic. If you do have to have IP-based traffic because of some weird thing you have going on a weird port, limit it to a single host or even to a single subnet. There are so many features and functions available in just these first two things you've talked about that we should already be doing,
Yep.
that it should make this a
Yep.
moot point, right?
Yep. And then, I shared something on Twitter and LinkedIn the past couple of days about blocking the actual execution of those RDP files, blocking the, redirection of resources. So there are group policies, there are settings in Windows to configure all of this stuff. So you can block, RDP files from, you can disable, excuse me, the redirection of those resources. So you can disable the drive mounting or the drive mapping. You can disable the printer connections, the clipboard. There are all those settings in group policy where you can configure those. So that's something I highly recommend. I mean, you can get templates for this. You can configure them manually. There's all sorts of ways to configure this stuff. But the point is, you can configure what is allowed from an RDP standpoint. You can even
Right.
disable RDP to begin with, right? If you have, Susie in accounting probably never needs to RDP, right? And likewise, if your IT shop or if your IT department and you use some sort of remote management software, you probably don't need to RDP to Susie's computer either,
Right.
because you have your RMM software. So being more restrictive around RDP, what gets mapped when it's used, those kinds of things is also a beneficial control.
Yeah, no doubt, man. And I think you have mentioned here that their CIS benchmarks specifically
Yep.
address some of these issues.
Yeah, see, these are in the CIS benchmarks. They have been for a while, I think. So these are not, anything new. It's just goes back to what you said. It's the foundational stuff: hardening, blocking, and tackling. Like, read through the hardening guides and be like, oh, maybe I should configure that. It's although hindsight 2020. Who 3 years ago, if you're looking at the hardening guides and the benchmarks, like, you can't think of an attack, right? Because maybe there wasn't any information about it, or just it wasn't well known, or whatever. So all those unsuspecting attacks are now coming to light. This just is the one that happens to be coming to light today or this week, and it just specifically references a benchmark as a mitigating factor. So
And that's exactly why I recommend whitelisting over blacklisting, right? And this has kind of
yep,
been this conversation has been around for as long as security has been around, right?
yep,
It's the reason there's a denial at the end of every ACL. And unfortunately, we have not necessarily drugged that over into some of the other aspects of security, such as what we're talking about now
Yep.
with file extensions and ports and services and stuff like that. But that's the recommended approach: is allow what you need and kill everything else.
Yep.
Because then, like you said, all of these attacks we don't know about, they should die anyway,
Yep.
because I'm only using what I need.
Yeah, and if you've already implemented the CIS benchmark, like group policies, you probably have all this stuff disabled or configured and mitigated to begin with. So
Yeah.
if you're somebody who is implementing the CIS benchmarks, you're using those group policy templates, you're a member of the CIS membership thing, you get those, you might have those already mitigated, which is awesome. If not, it's definitely something to consider deploying group policies to prevent or mitigate these types of attacks.
No question. No question.
And then lastly is user education. Like we should probably, teach users what, what would be suspicious, or like what would be a red flag. If I'm trying to connect to something and it's asking me to connect to this thing and click OK or accept, those are kind of the things that we want to teach users to be mindful of. We don't have to teach them, the attack in nauseam and how to define it and describe it. And like, I think there's a certain amount that we can get to, but I think some of the user education goes a little bit too far. But we need to teach users kind of how to identify this stuff, at least at a high level, and then give them a way to report it, right? Give them a reliable way to say, hey, this looks bad, that they can quickly click a button or notify IT or security so that they can stop it. And lastly, making sure that users understand that, it's nothing punitive should happen as a result of this. They need to let people know, let IT know quickly so that they can kind of cut it off as soon as possible.
Yeah, you don't need to know how to spell RDP to know not to click on the file, right?
Yeah.
So we don't need to explain like you said, how the attack works or what it is, but at the same time, hey, it's a file you don't recognize, and you were not expecting the email. Just don't. Right, report
Yeah.
that thing, and maybe you report something you shouldn't have. Fine, I'd rather have that than you letting ransomware in the environment, right, or something like that. So
Yep.
good stuff, man. Yeah, I really, like I said, I think I wrongly assumed that this would have been a dead in the water attack from the very beginning, because why would we be allowing RDP? But I would have been wrong had I made a bet on that. So
Silly Brad.
I know I should know better than to assume these things. All right, well, that's all we have time for today, folks. Thank you for listening and or watching. If you're looking at this on YouTube, if you enjoyed it, please share it with your peers, and check us out over at offsec.blog. And if you want to work with us, you can reach us at secureIT360.com. Spelling is in the description, and we'll see you guys next Wednesday.